I want to welcome you to the Basilica's Season of Creations lecture series. This series is made up of 3 lectures to introduce our parish to the Catholic Church's Season of Creation. This morning, we will hear from the second speaker in the series, Dr. Joe Fargione. And that's Fargione with the Italian. I have to use my hand for that because it's Italian. Last week, some of you were here. Father Daniel Griffith spoke to us about the scriptural basis for the season of creation. And today, we turn to the science. We turn to the science behind the challenges and changes that have affected lives globally and locally, and why it's so important as Catholics to become stewards of God's creation in caring and serving our common home. So why Dr. Fargione or Fargione? Well, you'd never guess because he's so humble, but frankly, because Dr. Fargione is frankly kind of a big deal. He is the director of science for the Nature Conservancy's North American region. His research has discovered nature's hidden benefits to all of us, including how nature can actually help mitigate climate change. Dr. Fargione holds a PhD in ecology from the University of Minnesota. He has held faculty positions at the University of New Mexico and Purdue. His scientific work, and this comes into his being humble, right? His scientific work has been cited over 28,000 times, leading to national media coverage on the NBC Nightly News, Time Magazine, and the New York Times. He co-authored the 5th National Climate Assessment, which is the United States government's preeminent report on climate change, its impacts, risks, and responses. Dr. Fargione is a native of Minneapolis. He is married to Rachel Holmes. Both are members of the Basilica, and both serve the Creation Justice Committee here. We are humbled to have a speaker of his caliber today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joe.
All right. Can you hear me? Touch that. Okay. All right. We have 2, all right. You can hear me and you can see the slides. So thank you, Deb, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for being here. You heard from Father Daniel last week about some of the basis in Catholic teaching for why we should care for creation. And so I won't try to add on that. I think he did a good job. I wanted to talk about some of the science. And so I like to start with some of basically the take-home messages in case, you have to leave early or you fall asleep. The main things are, climate is changing. It is us, it's human-caused. It's going to be, if we don't do something about it, it will be bad, and we can fix it. So the talk is kind of broken up into those 4 pieces. And we'll go through that, and then we should have a little bit of time for questions and discussion at the end. Okay, so the climate is changing. And the main thing that's happening is it's getting warmer. And you can see this. So these are the months. This is the temperature. It gets warmer every summer. And every little squiggle here is one of the is a line from a year starting from 1940 going to 2022, right? So there's 80 little squiggles, and then we can see last year in 2023, it was a lot warmer. It was well outside of and well higher than any of those squiggles. So it was by far the hottest year on record last year. So that's just 1 year, but you can see that it's pretty dramatic. But it hasn't just been that 1 year; it's been a trend, right? So ever since the mid 1960s, that black line is global temperature, and it's been going up, and the blue line is the United States, so also going up. And of course, the average globally is going up more smoothly. When you look at any given country, it kind of bounces around and goes up and down. Not sure what happened. Okay, all right. So it's been going up consistently for decades, and but it's not just, this is looking back to the late 1800s. But if you look back even further, if you look back thousands of years, this again, warming in degrees Celsius, it's warming. This rate of warming is more than we've seen in the past thousands of years, 2,000 years, and they're not shown on this graph, which only goes back 2,000 years. This is the warmest multi-century period in more than 100,000 years. So it's warmer now than it's been for a very long time. So it is in fact warming. And sometimes you'll hear people say, well, it hasn't been warming, for lately, or that trend isn't there anymore, and that is misleading. If you look, you can pick a handful of years and pretend like it's not warming, but if you look over decades, the trend is very clear, and it is very much warming. So these aren't the only, that temperature is one indicator, but the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has compiled all of the indicators, whether it's sea ice or ocean temperature or the glaciers melting or the flowers blooming earlier. And they, when you look over all tens of thousands of things they looked at, that signal is clear. So to answer, is our climate changing? Yes, that is incontrovertible, that it is changing. So the next question is, well, is that really because of people? And so let's talk a little bit about the science behind that. So the Industrial Revolution, we started burning coal, we started burning oil, natural gas, and burning those fossil fuels. And that has, so these are the annual emissions, right? So before the Industrial Revolution, our emissions of carbon dioxide, burning fossil fuels, was 0. And then we started, the Industrial Revolution happened, and the steam engine, and started burning fossil fuels. And now we're, so this is the last year we have data, 2023, it's about 37 billion tons of carbon dioxide emitted to the atmosphere every year, globally. And, okay, so that's the pollution that we are emitting. But the atmosphere is big, right? So maybe the atmosphere hasn't noticed. Okay, it has noticed. This is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so this is the last 800,000 years. And carbon dioxide bounced around between 180 and 280, and now we're at 420. So it's a 50% increase in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that is directly attributable to burning fossil fuels. We have a pretty good idea of the fossil fuels we burned, how much carbon dioxide that emits, and when you look in the atmosphere, a little less than half of it is still there. Some of it gets absorbed by the oceans, but a lot of that carbon dioxide we've put in the atmosphere is still there, and we've blown past this anything we've seen for the last 800,000 years. Okay, so we know we're polluting the atmosphere. We know it's there. Is that affecting temperature? Well, when we look back over the last 400,000 years, carbon dioxide and when it goes up, the temperature goes up. So there's a pretty clear correlation there. And we can talk a little bit more about what's caused past changes in temperature, but the thing is, we know that the physics of why greenhouse gases work to warm the planet. And we've known that for a long time. So this was things that were discovered in the 1800s. So going back to Joseph Fourier, he proposed and discovered the greenhouse effect. And so this is the most sciencey part of it. So if you want to tune out, basically the greenhouse gases are like a blanket that keep the Earth warm. And in general, so the sunlight passes through the atmosphere, it's not reflected, but then it heats up the Earth. And then the Earth, like all warm things, they radiate heat, but they radiate, it's infrared, and it's a different wavelength than the sunlight. And the greenhouse gases, they let the sunlight in, but they keep some of the heat from going out to space. And this is a good thing. It's natural. It occurred before the Industrial Revolution. Water vapor in the air is one of the greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is a much stronger greenhouse gas, and it adds to that effect. And it's good that it's there because in its natural form, if we didn't have any of that atmosphere, the Earth would be about 60 degrees Fahrenheit cooler. We'd be basically living in a permanent, like on a big ball of ice with no life on Earth. So the greenhouse effect, gas effect, is natural and it's good, and we're glad it's there. It's the reason life on Earth exists. But it's just like getting a fever, you have a good temperature range, and if when you're sick, it can get too hot, and that's not good. So, so Joseph Fourier, he worked for Napoleon. Napoleon died. He had some time on his hands, and he figured out the greenhouse gas effect. So we've known this for a long time. And so the challenge is now that we have added these greenhouse gases, and that the fact that carbon dioxide absorbs infrared heat and can trap that radiation that would otherwise be lost to space. This was independently discovered back in the 1850s. A British scientist, John Tyndall, and Eunice Foote, American, a New Yorker, who published on this in the 1850s. So this is stuff that we've known for a long time. It's basic physics of how greenhouse gases work. And so you'll often hear people say, isn't it just whatever? Well, isn't it the sun? No. So the scientists we've looked at all the alternative explanations for what's happening, and they can't explain the patterns we're seeing. The sun's energy has been going down, not up. So there's data on that, and if you look at since 1960, in the 60s, the temperature started going up, and the sun, this is the sun's irradiance, it's been generally going down. So that's not why we're warming, right? So we looked at this, there's numbers on that. That can't explain what we've seen. Isn't it just natural cycles? Well, what about El Nino or these kind of, there's natural variation. Those don't heat up the whole planet, right? So that you have El Nino, the heat can be in different places. It could be in the ocean or the atmosphere. And so, but it doesn't make it doesn't add energy to the system, right? It doesn't create energy. There's only so much heat, so much energy. So it can move it around. That's what El Nino does. But if it goes, if the atmosphere is going up, then something else must be going down. And that's, right, so here, if the temperature in the atmosphere is going up, if there's more energy there, then there must be an equal amount of less energy in the ocean. And that's that's what we've seen in the past. So this is from the medieval warm period, right? So there were places that were warmer, but then there were other places, that were cooler. So you saw this, that can happen with the Earth's natural cycles like El Nino and ocean currents moving things around. But what we've seen lately is everything's warmer, right? So there's just more heat being trapped. It's not just moving around. And then some people say, well, what about volcanoes? So no, volcanoes sometimes they can affect the temperature of the planet, but they actually cool it. They add the particulates in the atmosphere actually, they reflect heat on its way, the sunlight on its way in, and they actually cool it. So it's warming. We know it's us. We know that burning fossil fuels has added greenhouse gases. We know greenhouse gases warm the planet. We know the other explanations don't explain it. And scientists have been very consistently warning about this. So this says, we warned the US president about global warming 50 years ago. Well, this newspaper article is about 10 years old. So at this point, it was Lyndon Johnson received the first warning from scientists about global warming in 1965, so 59 years ago. And scientists have been very consistent in warning about this ever since. So are humans responsible? Yes, and I think there is incontrovertible evidence of that. When you ask climate scientists, 97% of climate scientists agree with that humans are causing the global warming that we have observed. Okay, so it's warming, and humans are contributing to that. And so people say, well, it's just a few degrees, right? So it's going to warm business as usual when people started warning about this was that the Earth might warm up 5 or 6 degrees. Well, it does that every day. Is that a big deal? Well, the difference between, if it were to be 5 degrees cooler, that would be than what it is. That would be another ice age, right? So that difference between now and the last ice age was 5 or 6 degrees. So when you're talking about the whole Earth, that's a lot of energy to result in that change. So it makes a big difference, right? We would be under a mile of ice right now if it was that much cooler. So you notice when these types of magnitude of changes happen, everyone notices. So what will happen, what has happened, and what will happen with ongoing climate change? The way I think about it is it loads the dice. So when weather is highly variable. Some days are cold than others. You can think about sort of rolling the dice. If you used to roll a 3, now it's a 4, right? If you used to roll a 6, now it's an 8. So some of these extreme events that are more intense drought, more dangerous heat waves, bigger wildfires, stronger and wetter hurricanes, are all signatures of climate change. And we can see that this is what's already happened. So this is the temperature in the United States today, so average over 21 and 22, and then compared to the average before climate change, so the first half of last century. And this is the across the year in Fahrenheit, it's already warmed, over 2 degrees in a bunch of places, including much of Minnesota. And so what happens, the greenhouse gases warm the Earth, and temperature is important, but it has these other knock-on effects, right? So when it's warmer, there's more things dry out more, right? Just you put something in the dryer, it gets dry. So we're turning up the dryer, and we have the heat, we have drier summers, and this is in part what has led to millions more acres being burned in wildfires in the western U.S. every year. And it also affects precipitation. It affects rain. So warmer air, as we all know, holds more moisture, right? You got a really muggy, hot day in the summer. There's more water in the air. Hot air can hold more water. And this is kind of an oversimplification, but it's carrying more water, and a lot of the dry places are drier and the wet places are wetter because it moves that warmer air is moving more water away from those dry places and dropping it. And so we've seen that this is summer precipitation, and you can see, you know, drier and more droughts in the west, and wetter in other places. But it's not just the averages that matter, right? How much it rains over the year is important, but how much it rains in an hour or a day is even more important when you think about floods and storms. And so that warmer air is holding more water, and we see bigger rainfall. So this is the percent change, the total precipitation on the heaviest 1% a day. So the 3 days a year it rains the most, how much did it rain? So we saw in the western US it's drier on average, but at the same time as it's drier on average, it's having more flooding because when it does rain, it's dumping it. And so that's how you get, Catherine Hayhoe is the chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy where I work, and she, instead of global warming, she refers to it as global weirding because it does weird things that you wouldn't think of, that it can be both on average drier, but also have heavier rains and more floods. And so these types of changes lead to more weather and climate disasters. So this is just from 1 year, from 2022, and it showed all of the weather-related events that caused over $1 billion of damage each. And so you can see, you know, there's wildfires in the west, there's hurricanes hitting Florida, and in Minnesota there's hail and severe weather, tornadoes and high winds. And so that's 1 year, but and this graph is sort of busy, but you can see on there's two things. There's the bars, which is the number of events. So the number of billion-dollar disasters has been going up. And then there is the cost. So this is on the y-axis. This is the annual cost. So this black line is the 5-year average. So we've basically been going to, you know, having $1 or $2 billion of costs a year. Nope, sorry, wrong. Having, 25 billions in cost to 150 billion in cost a year of disasters. And part of that is that we're building more stuff in the way. So all the homes they built on the coast of Florida, like, it's more expensive because when the hurricane hits, there's more homes there. But part of that is due to climate change. And so we can see here, this is cumulative over these 5 years, and you know it adds up. So Florida is getting over 90 billion in damages, but even in Minnesota, which we don't think of as, you know, we don't have the severe wildfires they have out west, and we're not being hit by hurricanes, but over 5 billion in damages in Minnesota. So this pace is increasing, right? So it used to be you'd get $1 billion disaster every 4 months. Then in the 2010s, it was up to every 3 weeks, and now it's, you know, every 2 weeks. So these are things that are in the news, and the scientists, like I said, it's not all due to climate change. Some of it is we put more stuff in harm's way, and you know, if you build a house there, that's extra damages when the hurricane hits. But part of it is due to those changes in precipitation and temperature that we talked about. And the scientists have teased out what the part that's attributable to climate change. So it's making the heat waves, it's making the wildfire, it's making the floods more likely. And I'm going to show a series of slides, and this shows why it matters that climate change is not binary. It's not like we're going to have it or we're not. It could warm 1.5 degrees, it could warm 2 degrees, it could warm 3 degrees, it could warm 4 degrees. And the point is, the more it warms, the more problematic it is, right? So right now, we've already warmed the world about 1.3 degrees Celsius compared to before climate change. So if it just warms a little bit more than it has already, you can see the number of 100-degree days, additional number of of days over 100 degrees. It's not too many, But now, if we let it warm 2 degrees, there's a bunch of places in the US that get a lot hotter, those kind of heat waves that cause premature mortality for vulnerable people. 3 degrees, much worse, and 4 degrees, much worse. So every degree matters, right? So when we are talking about climate change and trying to slow it down, every degree matters. It's not binary, like, oh, well, I guess we have climate change, so let's, not worry about it, it's too late. No, the amount it warms really matters. And the same thing with precipitation. So this is the number of days with extreme precipitation, that heavy rainfall, and it just, as the world warms, you see many more days with that extreme precipitation and flooding, the warmer that we would allow it to get. And this is something that Pope Francis has reminded us about. If I can go in my climate-controlled house and turn up the air conditioning when it's 100 degrees, not everyone can do that. And so it has disproportionate impacts on poor people. And that's true in the US, that's true around the world. When the hurricane hits, most people that can afford it have insurance and are fortunate to live in places that have functioning economies. They have insurance, but the poor people and the most vulnerable do not, and they're not the ones that have caused the emissions, right? So that's not fair, and that's true. China, if you look at the annual emissions right now, China, the most emissions come from China, but if you look at all the emissions since the Industrial Revolution, it's still the United States that has had the most emissions, right? So there is an issue of fairness here, that those of us in wealthy countries like the United States that have contributed the most to causing climate change have an obligation to help prevent some of the worst impacts on the poorest and most vulnerable people that are most at risk from climate change. And that's these types of impacts that we're talked about, are increasing the economic gap between the world's richest and the world's poorest, right? So in places that can build the seawall, that have insurance, that have the air conditioning, they are most able to adapt and deal with climate change. And some of these other places in other countries, including like island nations that are facing this existential threat of sea level rise, that's more problematic for them, and that's helping to widen that gap. And we won't dig into it deeply today, but these are there's increasing awareness of the disproportionate impact of climate change on communities that are more vulnerable. And many of you may have been to the Mill City Museum, downtown Minneapolis, and they have a nice little video narrated by our own Kevin Kling talking about the history of Minneapolis. And he talks about Bohemian Flats, that area underneath the Washington Avenue Bridge. And they have these great photos. It was a shanty town where many of the new immigrants lived. And they lived there because it was the cheapest place to live, because it flooded every spring. So it was rent-free because no one else wanted to live there, because every spring you had to leave and go stay with your friends because it flooded. So those types of patterns are still apparent today, right? People that are can't afford otherwise are the ones most in harm's way. Okay, so that's a little depressing, right? Like, the climate is changing, we've caused it, and it has some impacts that are scary. And so this is the good news, is that we can fix it. So, what we do, both individually and collectively, matters. So this is before the Paris Agreement. We were on track to warming 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius, and now with the Paris Agreement, if everybody does what they said they're going to do in the Paris Agreement, that is on average 2.7, and there's uncertainty. We don't know exactly because there's some feedback effects that are complicated. So, but it'll be between plus or minus half a degree. So we're in this range here today, and what we want to do is get down below 2. So we've made a big jump from where we were headed, and that for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about. And but we've got a ways to go. So I think that to me is encouraging. Our collective action matters, and if you look at, you can find headlines about the silver bullet that will fix climate change. Is geoengineering the silver bullet, or maybe quantum technology, whatever that means, is a silver bullet somehow, and that's not true, right? So there's no silver bullet. It's not one thing, but there are a lot of silver buckshot, right? So there are many different solutions that we have to lean into, and so this is the kind of simple way to think about it. So if the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is like the water in this pool, and you've got a hose going in, and at the bottom there's a little drain. That pool's been filling up. There's a drain there, but it's been filling up because we've got the hose on full blast. And so you want to drain the pool, to lower that water level back to more natural, you want to turn off the hose. So that's good. And then you also want to make the drain bigger. And then since we've already got this greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, it's also helpful to learn to swim in the meantime. So that's this. So this is this is adaptation. We're adapting to what's there, but we also want to fix it by first by turning off the hose and removing the carbon from the atmosphere and making the drain bigger. So turn off the hose. What does that mean? Energy efficiency, clean energy, land use and agriculture. Planting trees, being more efficient with our fertilizer to reduce those emissions. Behavior change, and we'll talk more about that next week, where our speaker will talk about what we can do to reduce our individual footprint, and carbon capture and storage. So there are places that fertilizer and steel and concrete that are currently having emissions that may be hard to stop, but that can be captured and pumped underground. And we can make the drain bigger, so we can protect our ecosystems. So the forests in Indonesia and Brazil that are being chopped down and burnt, that's emitting carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, making climate change worse. We can protect those ecosystems from that. We can restore ecosystems and plant trees. Regenerating ecosystems, that talks about agriculture and agroforestry and putting more carbon back into the farming systems. Other forms of climate smart ag, like cover crops that help rebuild the soil, and direct air capture. So there are people that are figuring out how we can remove carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere. And that's a ways out. But some of these protecting ecosystems and restoring ecosystems and regenerating and climate smart ag are all things we can do right now. Direct air capture is still in that research and development phase. And the goal is to get to net zero, where what's coming out of the hose is equal to what's going down the drain. So then when that happens, then the pool stops filling. So we will no longer be adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And so there's been a bunch of different modeling, but it kind of boils down to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we have a target of achieving this net zero by 2050. So we've got 25 years and the clock is ticking on that, and that'll be hard. But this is, there's a tangible goal for us to do, and it's something that people are making progress towards now. There are a bunch of commitments that have been made to achieve this goal of net zero by 2050. So many countries have proposed to do that. So looking across the roughly 200 countries in the world, about 150 with 88% of the emissions have pledged to do this. So that's encouraging when we need to hold people accountable to meet those targets and get there quickly. And then building resilience by learning how to swim. There's a whole bunch of things we can do with engineering the environment and ecosystem-based adaptation. So cities in particular get really hot if they don't have trees. So we need, so that you'll see people planting urban reforestation efforts as part of a climate adaptation response, and especially in communities that are the most vulnerable, that maybe have the least access to air conditioning and things like that. So I want to leave time for questions. So we could do most of these things. We could do a whole hour-long talks on each of these. So the good news is that we can fix it, and I won't go into too much detail, but wind and solar are now, the new wind and solar, that electricity that they produce are cheaper than if you were to build even a natural gas plant. They're as cheap or cheaper. So that technology has really dramatically changed. Solar gets about 40% cheaper every decade, and it has for decades. And so that trend is continuing, and we need to figure out how to add in storage so it can be base load. But we've seen some dramatic changes in the technological solutions that are available. And so that means the more things that we can electrify as we electrify our cars, or people are promoting electric stoves instead of the gas range and the stuff. Oh yeah, or crazy people have electric lawnmowers like me, which is so the more things that you can electrify, that will lower our carbon footprint. And so when you look, and many of these things will also save us money societally, in both directly because those forms of energy can be cheaper, but also indirectly because it gives us clean air and clean water, right? So we will avoid some of the damages that we're doing right now from fossil fuels that are not just from the effect on climate change, but also from the other impacts they're having, right? So it'll give us clean air and water, it'll protect us from disasters, we can restore ecosystems, have more affordable energy, reduce inequality, make our cities safer, give us more stability. We don't have people fleeing climate disasters and being refugees, leading to instability. So these are good things. This is from the National Climate Assessment, which says shifting to renewable energy, you lose some jobs, right? So you lose some jobs in the fossil fuel industry, but you gain even more jobs in wind, solar, and building out the grid. So the net gain is this. So you gain, 3 million jobs, and you lose 1 million. So your net gain is 2 million jobs. So so that's, change is hard, and there are people that will be negatively impacted. So you have to think about how to not have that. You don't want that to be inequitable. You want retraining programs and things. But on net, investing in new clean energy will be good for our economy. And this is a global study that right now, air pollution from fossil fuels contributes to over 5 million premature deaths per year. And it's, tens or hundreds of thousands in the US as well. So these are good things that are co-benefits from the changes that we need to make. And So I like this cartoon where it talks about you get all these benefits, if you're not polluting the atmosphere. And he says, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? So the way I think about it is, energy should be affordable and abundant, but also clean, and we can do that, and we can make a better world, while we're doing that. Okay, so last part of the talk, how do we get started? And this is advice from Catherine Aho, who is the chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy, as I mentioned, who says we need to begin with the one thing we're not doing, which is talking more about it and talking to each other. And so there's a quote from a climate activist: "Talk is the fertile field in which cultural change begins. In its absence, it's impossible for a group of people to solve a problem. And the goal of the conversation is not to tell people about climate change, it's to expand the number of people in the conversation." So that's part of what we're trying to do here today. And if you don't talk about it, why would you care? And if you don't care, why would you do anything about it? So we're trying to talk about it in the hopes that more people will care and inspire people to talk about it to others. And I think there's this idea that, it's political and we shouldn't talk about things that are political, or other people aren't worried about this, so they don't want to hear about it. Well, that may not be true, right? So here, this is the percentage of adults who are worried about global warming, and the national average is 2/3 of people are, right? So, if you talk about it, often you'll encounter other people who are thinking about this and are worried about it, and that's true in Minnesota as well. This is from the Yale Center for Communication on Climate Change, and they talked about how you can lump people into one of these 6 buckets as either alarmed or concerned or cautious or disengaged or doubtful or dismissive. And the folks that are in that dismissive probably aren't going to change their mind, don't really want to, aren't interested in or open to hearing alternative viewpoints, but that's only 11% of people, and that percentage hasn't changed, where this group that's alarmed or concerned is actually the majority of Americans, and that's gone up by 18% over the last decade. So, it's the people that are cautious or disengaged or doubtful that we're having those conversations might be most impactful. And this was another part of this is a survey from the same folks that looked at why people, what's the most important reason to reduce global warming? And the biggest reason for people was intergenerational, right? Providing a better life for future generations. And the second was to help prevent extreme weather events or prevent destruction of most life on the planet, which is a kind of extreme way to phrase it. But so those are some of the biggest. And then protecting God's creation was down here at 15 or 20%. And the point here isn't that one of these explanations is better than or another. The point is that people are individuals, and you have to speak to what reason might motivate them. And I think most people want to, recognize that we have a responsibility to leave the world in decent shape for future generations, and that whether that comes from their religion or other, just from their own personal ethics. And so, so this is advice on how do you talk to people about climate change? How do you talk about polar bears? And the answer is, you don't. You talk about something that is closer to home that people care about, like intergenerational, our obligation to future generations. You talk about farming and how the hotter weather is going to be a challenge for farmers and will cook their plants. You talk about safety and flooding and things that are closer to home. You don't try to change people's values, you say, what are your values? And you talk about how it intersects with those. You know, you talk about snow for the Minnesotans who like to ski and, you know, have had to, some of our cross-country events, ski racing events are canceled. And so their message, you don't have to be a certain type of person, you just have to be a human. You have to, you know, so the things that people care about will be affected by climate change, and how do we find those intersections with people? If it's an ideological thing where you have to have a certain ideology, we won't get enough people on board to care about it to help be engaged in the solution. This is the knot. We had to bring it back to someone Catholic here. So we have St. Augustine saying, hope is two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are. And this is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, saying every action matters, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and every choice matters. So we'll leave it there. And I'm excited to thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Joe. Dr. Fargione. That was incredible. Well, we're going to talk about this. So does anyone want to say something, want to talk about it? Ask Joe some questions.
So one of the concerns is the melting of the ice caps and the rising sea levels, and maybe you could let us know how this is going to affect people. It already is, I think. We're seeing flooding in low-lying areas, even in the United States. But again, the most poor and vulnerable are going to be affected most.
Yeah. This is still on, right? Yeah. Yeah, so flooding and sea level rise is one of those things where it really matters whether you're at 2 or 3 or 4 degrees, because there are thresholds. So you know, when you tip across that threshold and it gets warm enough, the glaciers slide off of Greenland or Antarctica into the ocean, that has a big impact. So it's non-linear. I think that some of those worst impacts will happen if we let it get above 3 degrees. And there are with sea level rise, there are 2 things that happen. One is thermal expansion. So the majority, sea level rise has already been 20 centimeters. Right, so, so less, a little less than a foot, but big enough that to make storm surges worse. And most of that has been from thermal expansion, just as the ocean warms up. And so if you add on to that a bunch of the glaciers and sliding into the ocean, then that could end up being several feet, and that gets really problematic. When we talk about, if you looking into the deep past, is also, illustrative. People will say, well, climate has changed in the past, and it's like, sure, and we've had a bunch of climates that no one would want. So we have had the Earth, in the geologic history, the Earth has been ice-free. There have been no glaciers. And if we had that today, we would be talking about the port of St. Louis. I mean, the Gulf would be all the way up there. So that would be really bad. There would, be a lot of flooding. So so that's a really important reason that every bit of warming matters.
Good question, thank you. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to say? Questions?
I noticed that, caring for God's creation actually went down, but I've often wondered or heard the idea that this is an existential problem, so it's for the whole world. Thus, as far as a life issue, I've read that it's actually the number 1 life issue, but I'm thinking that I was wondering if you thought that was helpful in the conversation or if that wasn't helpful, talking about that.
Well, I think listening and understanding what people's values are, and then finding that intersection. So obviously, if you're talking, to to a group like this at a church, then I think that that caring for creation message is really important. And other audiences, that may not be the one thing that resonates the most. So there was some interesting research that looked at the effect of Pope Francis. They had a little report called the Francis Effect, and they looked at opinion changes and Catholics and non-Catholics and in the U.S. And the changes for Catholics were consistently a little bit bigger in terms of understanding this as it's happening, and it's something to be concerned about, and that it's likely to have a disproportionate impact on the poor and most vulnerable. All of those were things that people had increased in awareness over time, but that Catholics had increased a little bit more than others. And I think that was attributable to the attention that Pope Francis has been giving this issue.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Is climate change regularly, or is it required as in education, public education, like even in grade schools? Maybe you don't know.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I know that for my kids that they have studied it, but I don't know if it's a mandated part of the curriculum.
That's a really good question, because I don't know if you've looked around, but most of the people here are not school age. So I think we all need to learn something. I'm hoping that they teach it in schools. Great question.
So what can we do? I mean, is that kind of a legislative type thing where we can impact it? I've never heard that talked about.
Good question.
Yeah, that's it. I don't know. That's a great idea. Yeah, that must be. I mean, there is a school curriculum, so trying to make sure that accurately reflects the climate science would be a worthwhile thing to look into. And I imagine there are people that are working on that, if it's not already the case. Yeah.
Because I think, just like with smoking.
Yeah.
When they tell their parents not to smoke, I mean, I think, and you can't do a lot, but I guess I just am voicing my opinion that I think children can have an impact, even little ones, on their families.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
So you said that the U.S. is leading in global carbon emissions. I don't know if you have this knowledge, do you know about what industry would be the leader in that pollution?
Yeah, so that it's leading in our cumulative emissions over the last 100 years. So yes, our emissions, the grid and transportation and buildings are kind of the biggest things. So we need to build more wind and solar and other zero carbon energy, and shift to electric vehicles, and in our buildings, use more geothermal, better insulation, better efficiency, and those are some of the biggest things that the U.S. can do to reduce our emissions.
And to follow up, do you think in the foreseeable future a way to produce clean energy like solar, electric, in a way that is not emitting carbon emissions to make the materials for clean energy?
Yeah, I mean, there's like a virtuous cycle. So the manufacturing would use energy from the grid, and as we put more wind and solar that's feeding into the grid, then that energy will be cleaner that they're used to make it. Yeah.
Oh, we have one over here by somebody very special.
So a big shout out to some people in New Jersey who I think had their question answered, also known as my mom and dad wanted to find out how to depoliticize the climate change conversation, but I think you've answered that. But I know you have coined the term natural climate solutions, so I was hoping maybe you could give us like a 1-minute elevator speech on what is a natural climate solution?
This
yes.
is Rachel, by the way. She's Dr. Fargione's wife.
Yeah. That was not
And
a
he
plan.
is her husband.
There you go. Yeah, that was not a planted question. Yeah, so I have a whole nother talk about natural climate solutions, which are how the protection, restoration, and improved management on natural and working lands can help reduce emissions and store more carbon on lands. And so that's basically, tree planting and protecting forests are two of the biggest. There are others which I can talk about, but in that talk, I start off with saying, imagine if we had a technology that could cost effectively remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and turn it into a variety of useful products. And it's like, oh, we have that. They're plants, right? That's what photosynthesis does. So it removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and grows wood and other useful products. So, that's can be a big part of the solution. We could increase in the United States where we have the pool and the drain getting bigger. So, we could increase that drain by about a gigaton a year if we planted more trees and we change our agriculture to have things like cover crops and no-till that help store carbon in the soil, things like that.
Anyone else?
Well, and a comment on that last note, I've heard that we're having more trees now as a result of the carbon in the atmosphere, which seems like kind of the Earth's cool, way of, opening that drain for us kind of naturally, which is pretty cool. My question though is on, is it true that, because I saw you mentioned in the Lyndon B. Johnson administration that that was where the first report was given on the climate change. But I've also heard like a conflicting thing, I don't know if this is true, that in the 70s climate scientists were talking about global cooling and that this was kind of a craze going on, and I've heard it in a term to discredit the climate change, it used to be, global cooling, now it's global warming. Is that a real thing that did happen?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So there were some scientists who talked about the potential for the next ice age, and that was a very dramatic thing. So it got put on the cover of Newsweek or Time or something. But if you look at the scientific literature, the majority of scientists were concerned about global warming even through the 70s. So, if you have 400 scientists saying one thing, but you have 4 saying something controversial, that makes for a good news story, but it doesn't change the fact that most scientists were more concerned about global warming all along. And I can do it. So if you Google skeptical science, there's a cool website that basically has every one of those criticisms, and then it explains the reality behind it.
Great question, great answer.
Hey Joe. So I love the idea of planting more trees as a way to mitigate climate change, but we have all these wildfires happening. Yeah. Are we able to replenish what's being burned through just planting more trees?
That's a great question. So, are we? Yes. Well, there's a lot of places we could replant. So, when you replant, you want to be smart about where you put it, and maybe putting it in the place that's most likely to burn isn't the place that's where you're most likely to get the most benefit to the climate. So, there are lots of places that are like where the forest was cut down and they made a pasture, and then maybe it's been abandoned and it could be replanted with trees. And that is true across the country, not just in places that are the most prone to wildfires. And I could say a lot more about that, but there are places that, many of the places that it burned, the area they burn is so big that it doesn't naturally, there aren't seeds. The seeds from the trees can't get there, and so those are good candidates for reforestation, with the caveat that some of those places in a future climate may not support that forest very well, so we need to be smart about the subset of those that are replanted.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any other questions?
Big fan of your work, Joe. Big fan of your work. I want to point out, and I'm sorry, I'm going to throw you another softball here, about your pipeline paper.
Oh, yeah.
And just talking about the availability of trees. And this is some place where there are the potential for government subsidies for nurseries. This is a place where we can, as a group, elevate the dialogue about the need to support the green industry, like nurseries, like people having jobs planting, et cetera.
Yeah, there are people that want to plant trees and they can't buy the seedlings because there aren't enough nurseries. So as the demand for, as we all experience with COVID, right, you can have supply chain bottlenecks that limit your ability to buy things you want to buy. So reforestation is no different. If you're a small business owner and you want owning a nursery, you don't want to go out and invest in expanding and planting a bunch of trees if you aren't sure that someone's going to buy them. So there's a chicken and egg thing of how do we ensure that those people have the right incentives and availability for small business loans and longer term contracts so that they know that they're not going to go out of business and get left holding a bunch of trees that no one wants to buy. But then we can build up those supply chains. And those are things that government can do to help support investment in restoration and natural climate solutions.
Thank you. I think that wraps it up. If we have maybe time for one more question, and then we will let everyone go home and start saving the planet.